Dark Night of the Soul. The dark night of the soul, the descent into destruction, suffering, and chaos, may contain the hidden possibility of rebirth. The dark night of the soul can be a zone of intense anguish where meaninglessness ascends and will to live descends. It is also a zone where great transformation is possible. Carl Jung, in his study of alchemy, related the dark night of the soul to the nigredo. Nigredo is an alchemical term for a condition of decomposition that was the first step in the transformation of base matter into the philosopher's stone. William James, the renowned Harvard professor, considered the father of American psychology, sometimes wrote in his journal, "Please, God, give me a reason to live for the next 15 minutes." I've had numerous dark nights of the soul. In a couple of the most acute episodes of despair, it felt like I would never be a functional human being again, and suicide might be the only remaining act of self-love possible. In the dark night of the soul, the old identity shatters, and the will to live may collapse. The great potential for metamorphosis in this state is that one lets the false self die, and there's a movement toward the experience of meaning. Only that which is deeply meaningful can bring redemption to the dark night of the soul. Most of my dark nights of the soul were triggered by shocks and great disappointments in romantic relationships. For others, they may be caused by the death of someone close or a spiritual crisis unrelated to specific trigger events. What came in to redeem the dark nights of the soul I've experienced was recognition of duty to others, that there were loving services I could still perform, and that if I could not be loved the way that I wanted, that I could still be love. Worse than the feeling of not being loved can be the loss of someone you love, or the feeling that your love isn't wanted, and or there's no one available to share it with. And recently I saw an excellent podcast about it was related to what's going on with suicidality in males, where it's significantly higher than females, and basically the psychiatrist being interviewed in the podcast said that the most common cause of suicidality in males was a feeling of a desire for belongingness with romantic partners, with groups, society as a whole was thwarted, and so I think that kind of feeling of social deprivation and rejection is a key cause for many dark nights of the soul. We are social mammals after all. The test I often recommend for separating what is truly valuable from what is false and superficial is to ask yourself, what will I remember well on my deathbed? The dark night of the soul is a deathbed for the false self, an invaluable chance to let go of conditioning and return to your essence. In spiritual lore, but also my own experience, dark nights of the soul are extremely valuable. What is not valuable, though, is depression. That's where it's more than one night. It's a chronic condition, which can be bad for the brain, bad for everything in life. And that depression could result from a loss of meaning, or it might be more physiological in origin because it does have some genetic components, apparently. My personal strategy is to allow my psyche to be highly dynamic. So when there is an occasion for tears, or a dark night of the soul, I let myself go all the way into it. I favor states of acute anguish over chronic depression. So if I need to have a dark night of the soul, I never try to self-medicate or get past it with any superficial technique. I embrace it, study it, and let it change me. I want my psyche to have a wide dynamic range between light and dark, rather than a medicated baseline. But every empowered person has to be their own physician, psychiatrist, and alchemist, and I don't assume that what works for me will work for everyone. Some people are not having dark nights of the soul so much as mental health crises that may require medical and other forms of intervention. Diagnosis should be a subtractive process where you seek to eliminate possible causes rather than jumping to a conclusion. If there isn't an obvious powerful trigger event, then first seek to eliminate or identify physical causes such as sleep disorders, substance abuse, poor diet, etc., before assuming a psychological or spiritual cause. My most acute episodes involved a convergence of physiological, psychological, social, and spiritual causal vectors, and all of those had to be addressed. If the dark night of the soul is happening to someone close to you, or that you're responsible for, take it seriously, and don't be too quick to think you know the cause. Ask about suicidal ideation. People who talk about suicide, but that you think aren't the type who will actually do it, will do it. I've learned that the hard way, twice. In one case, the suicidal person presented obvious and prominent psychological, social, and spiritual problems, which I addressed with her, but she did not disclose a substance abuse problem and a hugely significant medical condition with potent neurological effects. If she had, I would have given quite different advice and wanted her to work with a functional medicine psychiatrist and so forth. So you really got to probe into people to find out, like, what are they not telling you? I did inquire about sleep and diet, but I wish I had known about the other factors, which would have completely changed my counsel. We also need to recognize the limits of our ability to help. Sometimes we must encourage someone to get help we can't provide, and sometimes we might need outside help ourselves. So, have people call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, 1-800-273-TALK, 8255 in other words. Also, we must recognize that some people are determined to self-destruct, and there may be limits to how much anyone can help. If the dark night of the soul is yours, consider this an auspicious time to honor the experience and let it change you. Summon your courage to endure, and your true will can rise phoenix-like from the ashes of despair. So I have some documents linked up that are very relevant, like Savage Reflections, the soulful poetry of Jack Spencer Savage, who was a young person I was a mentor to and possibly the most brilliant poet of the millennial generation, but who took his life at the age just turned 24. But his poems reflect, he had been suicidal before I met him, but his poems reflect the agony and ecstasy. They're like the voice of the soul. And so they are powerful on the subject of someone who's contemplating suicide. Then there are other ones like Dealing with Shock and Awakening from Depression. The dark night of the soul can be hard to grasp in the abstract. All the major characters in my sci-fi fantasy epic Parallel Journeys undergo transformative dark nights of the soul. And I'm not selling anything because you can read this book beautifully displayed on this website, zaporacle.com. If you want the physical book or the Audible, which I think is probably the best version, you can get those on Amazon. And you can prevent me from having dark nights of the soul about how few people are reading this. So, another thing I recommend is a music video. It's linked there in the text of the card, text version of the card, called "My Body Is a Cage" by Arcade Fire. Embrace the dark night of the soul when you need to go through it, and let it change you.